Thank you all for joining the Capital District Special Education Task Force for our annual reviews, Coffee Q&A. I'm joined by Steve Oil and Tina Beauparlant. Steve, if you want to give a brief intro, and Tina, if you want to pop a brief intro in the chat, I can read it. I can read it for you.
Thank you, Helen. I would say that first of all, everyone, you're going to miss a great show today because when when she doesn't have laryngitis, she and I are really wonderful together. Very humorous, knowledgeable, and we come at the same work kind of at a little bit different perspective. So unfortunately, you're not going to get to hear us go back and forth. So maybe some other time, because I love doing that with Tina. My name's Steve Oil. I am a member of our Special Ed Task Force in the Capital Region, almost since its inception. I think Tina was there before I was, a little before that. But it's got to be 20 years now, I think, plus. And I've been in the field of human services since 1987. I've done a variety of things, but it's funny for for those of you who are parents, where your kids take you. When my son was 2.5, he was diagnosed with autism, and that led me over a period of a couple of years, moving from the other work I was doing in human services into doing family support and advocacy. Found the Special Ed Task Force. It's grown in 20 years. It's a wonderful statewide grassroots organization now. I'm proud to be a member of it, trying to help, trying to do what the mission of in New York State and the federal law, trying to help kids with special needs by working together with parents and school personnel and trying to get everyone communicating well and working together. So I come with a lot of experience, a lot of training, and I'm excited to be here today to help answer your questions. Is that good, Helen? What am I doing now?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Great.
And Tina is a parent of a 38-year-old son with Down syndrome and is the regional manager and education specialist for Parent to Parent of New York State. And she has been in the special ed field for over 35 years. So we have a wealth of knowledge here, and we're going to jump right into it. So kind of organize the questions that were pre-submitted by category. And so the first one we're going to go through is data collection. And so the question is, what data and supports should families request to address chronic school avoidance? So heavy hitter pointed one from the jump.
So, and can I just quickly add to I forgot to mention, I'm still in human services, but after doing family support for about 20 years, for 17 and a half years at Northern Rivers, where I started at Parsons, I'm still at Northern Rivers. Now I'm in our training department, actually. So, but I still have my credential as a family peer advocate. I'm going to keep that current, and I do some private work here and there. So, I still got my hands in it. So I want to let you all know that. Now, data collection. So on that question, and by the way, I noticed in the participants, I see there's family members. I see we have people from school districts. That is excellent. It's perfect for our mission. I'm glad everyone's here. Some people that I recognize the names, I know you, so welcome. It's good to see you all. You know, I probably a lot of the questions today are great questions, and we're going to answer them generally, but boy, you really have to look at each individual situation and each student. In terms of what to request, my first thought when I was reading this was, I have to know what I'm looking for first before I start worrying about asking the district to do certain things. So I want to look at, I know we're talking specifically here about, where did that question go? About chronic school avoidance. So obviously, I think the first main simple thing for me would be, well, let's look at attendance. And also I want to look at, sometimes the attendance officer is busy and they're just getting well, were they in today? Were they not? If they were here for an hour, maybe that counts as a late, or maybe that counts as not, they walked in, they walked out. But if I'm looking at an individual, I want to know if the kid made it from home out of bed into the school, even if it was for 2 minutes, or to the school in the parking lot and then couldn't go in. So you're going to hear this a lot today, but I want to team up with the district and kind of collect that data all the way around. There's sometimes where the school wouldn't even know that you showed up, that the student showed up. So we want to partner with the district and kind of have that information first. If you're looking for any more specific, and Helen, I know you'll be watching for whatever, if Tina's throwing info in, jump in. Well, the last thing I'm thinking on this at the moment is related to whatever diagnoses the student has. Now, I understand for chronic school avoidance, we might not be always talking about kids with IEPs, but if there's an IEP or a 504 and there's a specific diagnosis, then I want to be looking to that as well. I want to have that kind of inform what I'm looking for. So if I know I have a kid that has generalized anxiety that they're being treated for, or they just got diagnosed with, well, we want to be looking at that. If I have a person with autism that doesn't have any other diagnosis, but one of the common symptoms and sometimes comorbid diagnosis would be anxiety or fearful things and a lack of coping. So that I think you want to look to what's going on. Now, if you've got a kid that doesn't have an IEP or a 504 or doesn't have any mental health diagnoses or developmental, and there's a chronic school avoidance thing, let's see if there's something obvious that's getting in the way. Maybe, and I hate to get kind of negative, but let's just go with the negative for a moment. If there's any substance misuse going on or alcohol misuse going on, or do we suspect that staying up late at night playing video games and whatnot, but maybe you suspect there is something else going on, then you might want to try to get that youth evaluated or assessed for something mental health wise. So those are the kind of things I'm thinking. I don't know if Helen has anything to add or if Tina added anything to that.
Yeah, and Tina hit right on that. She said, what is happening in school and the family? Is the student struggling? And let's have a conversation to figure out kind of what's going on and what's the root cause of the school avoidance. And then she also mentioned that this could be any disability. It doesn't discriminate like most things. And then she had 3 really nice actionable steps to address chronic school avoidance. I'll put it in the chat so everyone can see it. It says family should request the following data and supports. 1, identification and assessment of school refusal by school-wide positive behavioral intervention and support teams. 2, tailored action plans collaborated with school districts to uncover the root cause of the school avoidance. And 3, data-driven comprehensive approach that engage students and families. So I'm going to put that in the chat for everyone to see if they want specific data and supports that they can ask for. I think that's great for that question. I'll mark it.
Great.
The next one under data collection is what kind of data is required for testing accommodations?
My first thought on that is often nothing. I mean, testing accommodations in my experience over decades now are not usually a struggle to get. School districts that part of the table are usually, if a student, it's easy to identify if a student needs those, if they need testing accommodations. I've rarely had to struggle to get those in place. That's my very first thought when I was reading this question. I don't know if Tina has other experience. Yes, so good. That's why great to have Tina on board. Should I keep babbling while you're typing? Let me know when to stop.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. Keep
All right.
on going.
Well, I think one of the themes I hope everyone comes away with today is communicating with each other. So schools and parents. I will say that. So I think in both these two questions, the big trick here is we'll talk with the team that you're working with, whether you're the parent or whether you're the school psych or the teacher, to get in touch with each other. A lot of times parents get I've noticed, a little bent out of shape when they don't hear anything. And I feel like, well, whether it's a small district or a big district, everybody's busy. They have a lot to do. And if there's special needs students, there's a lot of IEPs they've got to manage and work with. So be proactive, reach out a couple times, use email. If teachers want to use text, use texting, whatever it might be. But, at least start with that. That usually is a big help to teachers, is what I find.
And Tina added that recommendations of qualified professionals, proof of any past testing accommodations, observations by educators, results of psychoeducational or other professional evaluations, an applicant's history of diagnosis, and an applicant's statement of their history regarding testing accommodations. And I will also put this in the chat, and I will also do my best to remember to put the questions that we're answering in the chat as well, so that people can follow along. And please, just a reminder, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat and we will do our best to get through all of them.
And I'll add, that's a fantastic answer, Tina. And I'm sitting here thinking, boy, I looked like a real idiot up there when I answered first. I don't really feel like that, but I think I was kind of working on the assumption like we had that information already. So I'm really glad that you pointed it out, because I really missed a step there. That it's coming in, and that it's coming not just from out of a feeling of emotion like my child needs to have more time or whatever it might be, but also we have professionals saying, look, based on what we see, what we've diagnosed, here's some symptoms. This will be very helpful to have extra time or a quiet location or whatnot. I think maybe the spirit of what I was saying was that a lot of the accommodations come in because those things aren't usually in dispute, what Tina was talking about. So we have it coming from professionals and assessments, but people can usually see if there's distraction for ADHD kids, or even kids that have had trauma, that it manifests in distraction. I will say anxiety is a tough one sometimes, because a lot of times you can't see anxiety. So that is a bigger conversation, trying to make sure that everyone at the table understands that we have a diagnosis, and this student might manage it well on the outside, but it does not mean just because you don't see signs of anxiety, it doesn't mean that they're not feeling it during the day. So anyway, there you go. That's what I have for those.
That's perfect. We had a follow-up question that says, what about when it's test reading aloud as a testing accommodation?
In terms of getting it or monitoring it, or make sure it happens, like in
Per-
terms of
Perhaps in terms of what kind of data would be required. Oh, they say getting it.
like getting it on the IEP, not having it. Okay.
Correct.
Well, I'll tell you, with all my, again, help Tina's type in there, in all my experience as an advocate, you know, I would be looking to us, I would look for, well, where do we have that information from? Like, why do we think that needs to happen? And my first thought is that you're looking at probably some kind of a language impairment. So, a speech and language thing. Maybe they're fine in terms of being able to speak and understanding language, but if it's written, or maybe it's not as easy for them, which is why it needs to be read aloud. So I'm looking again to the professionals, the private professionals that you're using through your insurance, most likely to kind of drive that. And it might, the school assessments might be able to come up with that as well, especially on an initial assessment or a reassessment, when they do every triennials and whatnot. You might. I never try to pretend to be a school psych or a social worker or a teacher or a licensed professional, so I don't make that up. But I would think that there's certain things that a district is able to identify through that cognitive and academic testing, and it might come out that way as well. If I'm wrong, I'd love to hear that in the chat from people from the districts, but I don't know if Tina has stuff.
Yeah, Tina added, they need to show why the student needs the accommodation, and then again, have a conversation with the team why the student needs that accommodation. So reinforcement. And there is a test, someone put in the chat, thank you very much, that there is a test read form from New York State, which I will put that in the chat box for everyone. And I'll also keep a list of any resources, any helpful resources that are sent through the chat so that when I email everyone the evaluation, they can have a link to the resources.
I'm
So,
assuming that would come from NICEAD. I'm
yes,
not gonna, yeah, okay. Yeah, the
yeah.
State Education Board. Great, thank you. Wow, that's very helpful. Thank you.
And then the next question is kind of a three a three-parter, but it's overarching. I'm combining a couple questions. So it says, any information regarding measurable annual goals, how they are measured, and also how to present the results with the committee, because time is limited to discuss everything on the results.
I'm gonna work backwards. That last question, the third part about how to share it with the committee, especially if you're under time constraints with annual review, which is common in terms of time being limited. So the best thing to do is if you have that info, whoever you are on the committee, share it before the meeting. And I don't mean like the morning before. It'd be nice to have it 3 or 4 days before, a week before. That is really optimum for everybody. I'm certainly optimum for parents. I understand if it's coming from the district, sometimes there's a lot going on. There's a lot of work we expect from you. I understand that. But as I'll say this as a bottom line, if at least it comes in the day before at minimum, that will be helpful, because then you don't have to spend a lot of time on it during the meeting. You can come into the meeting with your questions about it as you've read it beforehand. Okay. Um, that's my first thought. Okay. Again, does Tina have, I know she's typing away, so does she have stuff on that yet, or should I just keep moving backwards?
Keep
Keep moving.
moving
All right,
back.
Tina. Okay. So, measurable annual goals. I tell you what, I think writing goals and objectives is an art form. It should be a science, but I think it's really an art form. And part of what makes it an art form is each individual student. Um, and we have to look at each individual student's needs. Um, so I think my first thing about that is, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I really want to team up with the district. Um, I, I don't want to write a goal. I want to have input into the goal as a parent. I want to say, here's what's happening. How are we going to address that? And I don't mean that to lump it into the district, but they're charged with writing it anyway. And a lot of people at the CSE meetings are going to be there. The people from the district, at least one or two people, are thinking about, how am I going to write this goal? Or I've written this before. I've written something like this before. So they're kind of in that mode, and I kind of depend on that expertise. I don't want to be another chef in there. Um, so, uh, you know, I, I think the first question was like, how do you do that, right? How do you write measurable annual goals? So, I'm a good parent, and I'm pretty good peer advocate, and I haven't really done a lot of that. I've really just worked with the team on that and making sure that the goal looks like it's addressing what the students' needs are. And when I'm advocating, I just ask the parent, and a big part of what I want to do in terms of advocacy is help make people's voices heard. So prep in terms of that area is going to be helpful. Sometimes you're at the meet your annual review and you come up with what the problems are or the issues and how we're going to work on that, and professionals will say, well, okay, I'll write that up and we'll send you the IEP. So sometimes what I think from a parent perspective, what you want to do is say, okay, I understand you're going to write up that goal. I don't know what it looks like yet, but I understand what you're looking to do. That sounds good. And they'll say, well, we'll send you the IEP, before by summertime, because that's when we send them all out. It's okay, I think, to ask someone on the team, the chairperson, saying, I'd like to get a look at that. It's January or it's April. I'd like to get a look at that particular goal, before summertime. Could we arrange to meet in 6 weeks? Like give you a month and a half to work on it. Or can you email it to me? Can I bug you in a month to email it to me? So I think it's okay to do that, not is certainly especially for one or two goals and objectives as opposed to the whole IEP. So that's my thought there.
Yeah.
How are they measured? Well, almost sounds like a cop out, but it really depends on how they're written first. Okay. Um, I, I could be wrong, but I think the idea of the second part is how are they measured is, well, how do you really what you're doing is collecting data, right? You have to collect the data, and that's going to come from the school. So um, I think let's say we have your annual review. Well, I think what I like to do, I want to establish communication with the team so that I don't have to wait 6 months to find out, oh, I don't like the way this is written. Or, gee, I don't know what's happening. Okay. I think that, like I said before, I know people in districts are busy, but we can just establish, say, look, we don't need to have a whole meeting. I just kind of want to get it. Can you tell me in 6 weeks? Can you tell me in the middle of, at the end of February, or maybe the first week in March, as of right today? Can someone send me some preliminary data on that particular goal that I'm concerned about? Can you tell me what's been happening? You know, and if the goal is written that the student, if it's a speech goal and they're working on making certain sounds, or they're working on social skills through speech and how to use conversation appropriately, um, in the least there should be some subjective data collected. In other words, observations and saying, here's what we worked on in the last 12 sessions, and here's what I've noticed. Now there's much more comfort for the student. They're able to initiate conversation and whatnot, and use the sentences and the phrasing that we've been working on. Even that is helpful. It might not be, what's the right word? It might not be, data points that you can say, hey, we met 12 times and they did this 20 times during those sessions. But that's why it depends how the goal is written. I think Tina's done typing. Hopefully she can add to that. That's
Yeah.
kind of what my thought was.
And going off that, she said parents can also request the data from the teachers to see how the child is doing with the goals. But I'll circle back. So the question was information on measurable annual goals, how are they measured, and how to present the results with the committee. And so Tina said that you can have a pre-CSE meeting to talk about all the goals and the IEP overall. The goals should describe specific skills, behaviors, or knowledge that the student will demonstrate with that year, that school year. They must be measurable so that progress can be assessed. And then PLAFs, it sounds like my dog's name, kind of. Profiles of learning and adaptation functional profile should be written in simple terms that are specific, measurable, and objective, that everyone can understand what they mean. And then she linked to some websites that you can check out on helping goals. Measurable annual goals address academic and or functional needs identified in the, how do you pronounce that, Steve? PLAA
But oh no, I'm sorry. PLAA.
FP.
I've never pronounced that before. I would just say flaps. I
My
don't
dog,
know.
my dog's name is Flaffs, and I've never heard an acronym or anything that sounded anything quite like his name. So pardon my sidetrack. Um,
I would probably just spell it out, the letters PFL, AAPS.
yeah.
Yeah. That's me. Tina's
Tina's
got
got
more for us.
one more thing to add. She said, um, not use jargon that we have. Sorry, I give me 1 second.
Not use jargon that parents don't understand.
Don't use jargon.
Clear.
Yes, don't use jargon that parents can't understand. Make it clear, both in acronyms and in annual measurable goals. Awesome. And I think we hit all 3 points of that question, which is now going to lead us to our next section, which is I'll do this one next. We'll do this one next. Different school settings and additional services. So the question is, can we talk about services for those enrolled in different settings? For example, P-TECH or Smart Scholars?
So I'm gonna just be very transparent, very upfront. Like P-TECH or Smart Scholars, I'm not very familiar with. But the idea of services outside, like at a different setting. So like again, I'm going through the special ed realm here. I'm thinking of a BOCES setting where it'd be a classroom in a public school or a local, there's a couple of places that are self-contained BOCES program schools or day treatments or whatnot. So that's what first thing I'm thinking if we're talking about that. So services should be delivered certainly on an IEP. Now, if I'll put it this way, in general, a student with an IEP 504, if there's services, and there should be services on there, whatever the setting is, they need to be delivered. And that's including like if a student gets suspended for a quarter, for 10 weeks or whatever it might be, those services still need to be afforded to the student. Location becomes part of the issue there. So sometimes you have to bring them to the school or to another setting like a library nearby. You work that out with the district. It's rare anymore that tutoring comes or the services will come to the house to be delivered. I have not heard of that in a while. I guess it's a possibility, but it's not very probable. In terms of, so I think that's one thing. I don't know if Tina's, let me know when Tina's ready to, when she submits something here. And so in terms of services in other places, yeah, they should be delivered. I think that's, I know I'm being pretty simplistic today, but that's the first thing I'm thinking in terms of that. Is there another part? Helen, could you read that again? Maybe I'm missing some, just that one question.
Yeah, basically just if we're able to talk about services for those enrolled in different school settings. So I think that can be a tough question because there's so many different school settings. Like you said, if you're in a BOCES program, there is any number of paths that you could be on.
Right.
So, but I think you said it. The services or the services that you get within the school should be able to be given if you're not in the school. Yeah, Tina said services are services. It does not matter what the setting is. It depends on what the student's needs are. So those services may look different based on the track that they're on, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the services must be provided.
And in terms of like, can we talk about, that was part of the question. Can we talk about, we have a conversation about it? If you're talking about like here, we're doing that, great. If you're talking about that in terms of at your annual review or with the team that you're working your child's team, from a parent perspective, what I would say is if you're getting pushback from the rest of the team, like, well, we can't do that. Let me, along with this, I am very sympathetic to what the pandemic has done. There's positives that have come out, meetings like this today, trainings like this, a lot of people can attend because we're not at a geographic location. We can access Zoom. But I know there's a lot of struggles for education and teaching, and I get that. And I know we've had there's still a job force crisis. We can't get enough people to work. So I understand districts have difficulties. The thing for me is that should not be part of the conversation at an annual review or with your students' needs. And I understand that sounds harsh to some of the school folks here because you're like, you can't get blood from a stone if you don't have enough people. But I think first, what should be discussed and agreed upon is what does the student need? How are we going to address those needs? Then you're right, you can't get blood from a stone. And I understand that. So let's first get what should happen, and then we can deal with we're trying to hire people. We don't have enough people. We're working on that. That's a whole, to me, we should separate those things. So if you're getting pushback at a meeting with practicalities, I try not to engage in that. I try to say, well, I feel for you, but we need to first look at what does my youth need. So that's clearly from a parent perspective, but I wanted to share that.
Yeah, and that leads really nicely into another question. I will read what Tina said, which also helps. She says, now some programs may not want to allow aides in their programs, but again, what does the student need? She echoed that there is a huge shortage with regards to staff. And the next question is, how do you handle making recommendations, not knowing if the staffing will be available? Do you let that not that just knowledge hinder what you're asking for, or do you just go for it anyway? Do you try to prepare around it in preparation for knowing that there will likely be a staffing shortage?
You know, it's interesting to me because I'm sitting here thinking, well, is that coming from a parent or is it coming from a school person? I guess in some ways it shouldn't matter, right? But I think that I think I would stick with what I just said. So I can be sympathetic to the realities of the job force crisis, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And we can't try to hire or find people if first, like we need to find at least in these annual reviews and whatever other meetings we're having with the team, first we have to look at what does this student need. I think that's what the law talks about, and the law hasn't changed. How do we meet the students' needs in their special education? So I think you have to start there. And even if so I'll give you an example. I'm starting to imagine this idea that you have a good team, the parents, the family, and the team at the school, whether it doesn't matter the size of the district, but you have a good team, you get along, you know each other, you respect each other, you like each other. So, I understand now, like, ooh, if I now the only problem I have for that from a parent perspective is, well, but I'm glad I have that, but that is not part of my problem. Part of my problem is really focusing just on my student. So I would not change. I wouldn't come in screaming and yelling. Of course, I didn't never do that at meetings anyway, knocking on wood. But, um, but I would not come in worried about the administrative problems and the logistical problems of society in terms of this. I would come in saying, uh, representing my family and my child. That's what I would do. And I would ask for whatever I think he needs. And again, it comes back to um, identifying what they need, not even asking, just saying, well, here's the problems. How are we going to address this together? Okay, that's what I would do, and I would hope that if you do that, that the rest of the team would understand your position and would not make you feel bad about that. That's the problem with the dynamic I think that I'm describing. If you're in tight, and it can go both ways, but if you're in tight together, ultimately, like we have to focus on the student, but we each have our own problems in terms of what we need to do. And those relationships should not hinder us from advocating for what we think is needed for the student. And that goes all the way around the table, teachers, the parents, everybody.
So Tina had some nice things to add. She said, we need to assess the situation, pause and examine the current staffing needs, acknowledge staff concerns, understand their needs and don't assume, helping staff prioritize their needs, and avoid panic hiring. Be cautious not to overhire. We had a nice note from a district person. It says, as a district person, I agree with what Steve was saying. The logistics of the recommendations should not be discussed around the table. The recommendation is the recommendation. What does the student need to access FAPE? That is the recommendation. The logistics come after that, and the district might be out of compliance due to the lack of provider, but we need to do But we need to document our due diligence as a district. And then Tina added, each year is going to be different with regards to staffing and your child's needs. We all need to work together. I love this though, kind of going back to services being provided outside of the school setting. It doesn't matter. The services need to be provided. Here, the recommendation is the recommendation. It doesn't matter what the staffing issue is. You figure that out afterwards.
Wonderful.
I think that was a great question.
Yeah.
So now we've got a couple of more targeted questions for additional services. How can you effectively, is there a way to, or tips to request after school tutoring so there is no disruption during the school day?
Mm. So my first thought as a strategy is like when I think of services for special education students, like tutoring is not a service. And even when if a student's suspended and it's not really, we call it tutoring, but it's not tutoring. It's really called home instruction. Um, so um, so I think tutoring, the word tutoring, it's kind of like the word respite in terms of human services. That respite means a lot of different things. It shouldn't, but it means a lot of different things to a lot of different providers and how it's done. And I think tutoring, we throw it around a lot. So in this question, I like the idea of, hey, you don't want them to miss anything during the day. But I think it gets tricky in the afternoons to kind of say, well, I would like tutoring. So the next thing would be, well, could you get a service provided in the afternoon is what I'm thinking, after school. And, I understand the sentiment behind, I don't want them to miss anything else during the school day. Um, I don't have a good answer for that. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, there's nothing, I don't think there's anything in the law that requires anything after school. That's one of the problems. So you have the kind of school hours, and the law gets a little more complex because then you also have unions involved for teachers and providers at schools. And some teachers might work outside of whatever union hours, and some won't. And I respect both of those. I understand both sides of that. So that's kind of a catch as catch can idea in the first place. In the second place, I just don't know of any way to make that happen. I see Tina shaking her head. I don't know if she means she's agreeing or she's going to give us some info that I don't have. But you know, I think if you're going to get that addressed at all, it's got to be very creative. It's not going to be very official. It's going to have to be, how some years you have a teacher that your youth really, the teacher gets the youth, if their style works well with the youth and things really blossom well. Maybe other years with different teachers, it's not the same. I think it's one of those years when you get a provider at school that is able to be flexible, is willing to be flexible. You might get somewhere, but it's not, I don't think you're going to see it on an IEP. It's just going to be something that happens. And I think what I'm describing is, if it happens, it's extremely rare.
Yeah. And Tina said, parents are not entitled to tutoring. Some schools may offer a tutoring program, but it's not mandated by the law. Parents can hire their own tutors and they can do it after school hours and pay for that on their own.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things I think with services on 504s or IEPs is, especially on IEP, if it's mandated, it's got to be delivered. There's only a certain amount of time, so that's just how it works. Kids are gonna have to miss certain things. I'm a pretty positive person. I don't want to sound like a downer on that one, but that's just reality. And my feeling is, whatever service that they're getting, whether it's social work or PTOT, speech or music, whatever it might be, music therapy, that is, whatever service they're getting, if we agree as a team that they need that from the assessments and from our discussions, they need it. Like if I have to go get physical therapy for a sore shoulder or rehabilitating, I got to take that out of my day somewhere. So if I might have to take time off of work, or I have to get up earlier, go first, like it's got to fit in somewhere. And I feel like the same thing is true here.
Yeah. I think that covered that one. Next, we have, I'm gonna sort of toy with the phrasing. It says, what to do when a school district tries to argue for residential placement when they haven't observed all of their options first.
Um, so my first thought when I looked at that, my first thought was residential is a big deal. Okay. For the student, for the family, for the district on personal levels, needs levels, and also the pragmatics of a district sending a kid to residential. It's a big commitment. And my first thought is why I need more information. Whoever I'm hearing from, if I'm hearing from a school district, if I'm hearing from a parent, my first thought is I need more info. Okay. So, and to that specific question, my thought is, hey, if I'm working with a parent and they're like, well, they haven't done everything else. My first judgment, my first opinion is I'm doubting that. I'm doubting that they haven't done everything because districts don't, just from the cost alone, they don't lightly make residential referrals in general. Yeah, okay. That's a judgment. That's a value judgment though. So that's why I look for more information. So I wouldn't say that to a parent. I just would say, I'd like to see, let's talk about, you tell me what's going on about things they haven't done yet. And let's look at that. And I'm going to look as an advocate, I want to look at what the parents telling me. It should be easily verified in writing somewhere, right? We talked before about measurable goals. So there should be information tracking currently in the IEP on the objectives and the goals. There should be, if they're at a point for residential, there should be some sort of history about the high needs of this student. Whether they be behavioral or not, that's not really the same necessarily. It could be just really intense needs in terms of education. So I would look for that info and then assess it. And in this case, I would assess it first with the parents. Say, let's look at this together. What you're telling me and what we read here, does it match up? And if it matches up, then I would say, okay, let's start with a conversation with the committee. Let's call a meeting and talk about this. And hopefully in an objective world here, hopefully what would happen. So let's go with the notion that in the question that the parent is accurate. Like, gee, they haven't done a lot of other stuff. They haven't finished the things they should have been doing first. Why are they jumping to residential? Well, then that should come out in the conversation very easily. We could look at the same data together with the committee, and hopefully that the district in this example would say, all right, let's go back to this. Let's look at this closer. Maybe we fell down a little bit. Let's if they really have, let me just speak vernacularly. If they really have a bug stuck in them, they want to get this kid out for whatever reasons. Even in that scenario, the district hopefully would say, okay, it's January. Why don't we meet in the third week in March, in 2 months? Let's meet in 2 months. We're going to take data. We'll send it to you every week. And we will also, and we'll look at this really close and tight and et cetera. And then we can reevaluate. Now that's not a lot of time, but if they're going to look at it closely, again, like I think parents get cynical sometimes when we shouldn't. You can't, if you're collecting data about what's going on, it's pretty easy to verify as long as we're paying attention. So don't get cynical like they're going to make things up. That's not really going to happen. That's not how it works, especially at a committee type of scenario. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. I don't know if Tina's ready with info or not yet. Should I babble a little more?
Oh, here we go. Here we go. She said, residential is the very last thing they do. They must and will try to use all other options first before they consider this. A school district may argue for residential placement when they haven't observed all the options first by emphasizing the need for therapeutic supports and the lack of generalization of life skills gains between school and home or community settings. Parents may also argue for a delay in placement pending the IEP process. However, this can lead to protracted litigation. So,
And oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Helen.
no, I was just gonna say as it sounds like there are certain situations in which a school district can argue for residential placement without exploring all of their options. Otherwise, it is the last option that they can consider.
So we said this is a coffee Q&A. So I'm going to raise my cup because I want to share something that I'm thinking about that I hope will be helpful. Here we go. I might have to walk to the microwave and warm that up. But anyway, not yet. So let me dive in a little bit just on some of this. So let me take it to a public school setting, in the similar scenario, going to a higher level of care for education. So one of my beefs in general is that if sometimes families want a kid placed in an outside BOCES program or a day treatment, and they've got some support for that. Sometimes districts don't want to do that right away, especially when you have things like that where a kid's not a big behavioral problem, but there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of school avoidance, let's say, or whatnot. So what happens is, though, if a student has some kind of really intense behavior, whether it be physical aggression or self-harm, maybe, or sometimes really just I don't know, this is not very clinical, but a real big freak out situation, very upset in the school, and everyone gets upset, as we should. You don't want to see other people in a bad state like that. Sometimes, usually with aggression, though, is when districts will be like suspended, and now we're going to look at outside placements because we can't handle that here. But the problem that I have with that in general is it's like this one piece of the barometer. And once it's a behavior problem, then the district's all in. But what I tell parents is like, and parents get offended by that. I'm like, well, you can be offended, you can be upset. I understand that. But the big picture is we're looking at an outside placement, which is really going to be best for your child. And I bring that up because in terms of residential, it's true. Like, you don't placing a student or youth in a residential program is traumatic, no matter what their needs are. It's traumatic, whether it's behavioral problems, whether it's a medical thing. It's just a traumatic thing, obviously, for the student. But if you think about it from a healthcare perspective, or you want to help this kid to grow and improve, maybe it's exactly what they need. You see what I'm saying? So I think we just want to keep that in mind. What does the student need, and try not to get caught. So if I could take another angle on this question, the specific question, and I don't know the family or the situation, so obviously, so I'm just taking an angle just to try to explain this perspective. If this is what the student needs, if you don't, you might not want that, but if it is like, gee, this is really what my kid needs, then I'm not going to worry that other things haven't happened. That's all I'm trying to say, like that the district hasn't done everything. I think I'll do one more quick example. I remember when my guy was in preschool, and there was integration options in the school. But when he started, he couldn't talk. He had very receptive language, was like at a 6-month-old, and he was 2.5, almost 3. So I wasn't worried about integration at that point, because I understood he needed to be taught language. He needed to be taught to understand language. He needed to be taught to speak if he could. And he needed one-on-one for that. He needed discrete trial work. He needed to be in a small 612. But some parents, the big picture for them is integration. And I'm like, hey, I am all about having typical neurotypical kids and non-neurotypical kids together and learning from each other. But yet I think we have to look at, for the disabled students, are they able to, is it going to be helpful to them in terms of their learning, especially when they're little like that? So you see what I'm saying? Like, sometimes I think we want to pick our battles, is all I'm saying, and kind of really go back to what does the student need right now. So I'm not trying to judge anybody. I'm not saying your question was wrong or anything else. I'm just using it as a jumping off point that I was thinking about, that let's not let our feelings get in the way of what do we see that the student might actually need. So I hope that suits everybody. I just an idea I was thinking as we were discussing this.
Yeah, and we got some great notes in the chat. It says legally, we as districts have to at least try. Sorry, let me back up. Legally, we as districts have to try least restrictive settings first and or justify why a more restrictive placement is necessary. In the STAC system, there is a very clear checklist to complete that justifies this recommendation and reimbursement. Someone else said, if a requested review results in a recommendation for a more restrictive setting and is being tutored while, sorry, I jumped, and is being tutored while a placement is found. Oh, sorry, that's a question. Ignore that. I'm going to ask that after.
Okay.
Another note says, one logistics issue. Some districts geographically do not have day treatment program options that are within a drivable distance. Therefore, the district has to jump from BOCES to residential placement because day treatment is not accessible due to location.
Mm.
And then one last thing, Tina said, I'm working with a family that has 2 children that the school has tried to locate BOCES placements for 2 years. They cannot locate one. The CSE is now looking into residential and the family does not want this. We have had to explain that no program can be located and residential is the last thing the district can do at this point. So again, when all options are exhausted and everything's been done, only at that point can the residential treatment be considered.
And I want to add, yeah, those were great comments. And I want to add, this is why I think communication and continue to communicate throughout is really important, because sometimes I'm cynical with my experience, but also sometimes I also try to be very hopeful. And I feel like you don't know where the conversation will lead us to or the team to. And I think that was Tina's situation or she's working with, she was describing, and that sounds unfortunate in a lot of ways. But also, even in the example, someone who added to the chat about geographically, and there's not day treatments nearby. So I get that, I do. In my mind, I look at each case individually. So if I'm helping a student in that scenario and there's no day treatment within a drivable distance, I want to have that conversation together. I want to make sure the family understands that, has chances to ask about that. I never want to assume I know what other supports a family might have. So maybe, for example, if we have a conversation, maybe the family's like, you know something, I've got someone that lives, let's just say within 50 miles. So it's less than an hour drive. Let me see if they will I can let my kid live there during the week and get bussed over for the day treatment. And I'm not making assumption that these things don't happen. I'm just want to highlight that these conversations should happen. I feel like I don't just want to empower families with information, but I think it's important. I'm going to share a quick side thing here. Google Maps and CarPlay. Got a new car last year, and I'm like hip now and use my iPhone in the car and it's all hooked up. I can't stand when Google sends me to the same location different ways. And also I can't stand when Siri, as it were, won't tell me why she's doing it a certain way. Makes me nuts. I need, I'm like, she just tell, and don't put in the chat, there's ways to do it. I'm sure there's ways to do this. I'm not interested in that. I just want to share this. I'm just like, if I put it in every day, I know where I'm supposed to go, but I want to know which route is better. So I'm assuming she's going to send me the shortest route and she's going to keep an eye on traffic. That's all I'm looking for, which highway to take to where I got to go. And she never tells me any of that. And I always doubt her when she's like, "We'll go this way." I'm like, "Why?" And I want to talk to her. I'm like, but I think I bring that up because it's the same thing here. Like you, everyone's busy. You're going through doing your job. Make sure you're doing your best to inform families and let them know. And sometimes that means you need to it's better to have a meeting, not just send an email. Sometimes people need to process information, and an email might be misread or not fully explored. I know, sometimes I do that. I have to go back and read an email later, maybe the next day, and say, I didn't even see that yesterday because I was so mad about the first part. So I just want to push that communication thing especially with these difficult situations for all the parties.
In virtual, like COVID gave us this virtual space, which can be such a gift because we're able to have 69 people in this room at once on a Friday, all talking and learning together. But you're absolutely right. There's situations when they're heavy and important to be in person, have that face to face, be able to ask questions and just feel physically seen. So I
Well, and if I could just add to that, I might be the only extrovert that loved the pandemic. I loved working from home. I got so much work done. Half the time I'm the problem. If I know Helen's in the office, I'm like, I'll just go over and ask her. But when I was home, I never called her. You know what I mean? People just don't do that. But I want to add, what I want to say is, as much as I like being in person, this to me, this is great. So if we had to have a meeting, the three of us, it's so easy to do it on Zoom. And I think we should abuse that. We should use that more often. So I want to clarify that. I wasn't pressing we had to be in person, but I do want to impress. We need to be able to interact. And if it's on Zoom, that's fine. As long as we're able to interact, kind of see each other,
and they
read. Yeah. Yeah.
Tina added, parents need to understand that meetings can be virtual or in person. So you said, if it's a heavier topic, you can have it in person, or you can choose to have it online, but you can also be in person. A question that came in that I think it could be a quick one, and it'll round out the different school settings and additional services, which keeps us right on time, is if a requested review results in a recommendation for a more restrictive setting and the student is being tutored while a placement is found, do you write the program recommendation for the new program or the old program? I'm guessing
I
that
would think, I mean, the idea with um, home instruction while you're waiting for a placement is that, I mean, the home instruction is instruction, okay? And that's not the services. So you have the home instruction, and then you have, if there's services being delivered, they're going to be delivered at a different time than that. And so, I mean, I bet you we should probably hear from districts on this. I hope they
we've got
chime in. But my
we've got
first thought
districts
would,
in the
yeah,
chat.
my first thought would be, as a parent, I want my kid to whatever we can do for him while the home instruction is happening, and whatever's going to make the process work better. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, if writing it for the future thing, future program, the IEP that way, then that's what I want. If we need to keep it the same, and in some ways, I'm thinking a lot of times when you get to an out of district placement, what happens is that program kind of puts an IEP together based, they kind of write their own IEP based on what the district's already given them and based on what their program provides. So in some ways, maybe it goes back to maybe you keep it as is, we send the referrals out and you have the information about what this student needs. I would kind of defer to the district, I think. I don't know if Tina agrees with that or she has better information, but
So we have in here, per NICEAD and SEQA guidelines, you write the recommendation on the IEP and the home instruction is listed on the PWN. I'm not, or prior written notice, PWN, okay.
yeah.
And then that sounds good there. Okay, so now for the second half of our presentation, we've got two more sections, IEPs and beyond IEPs. So the first question is, IEP goals drive the IEP. IEP goals tell a story. If the goals are not met, are the IEP services inadequate? I'll put the question in the chat if that's helpful.
Yeah. If the goals are not met, are the IEP of the services inadequate? So again, my first thought is I don't make the assumption that the cause and effect is directly related. Okay. In my mind, without thinking a lot about it, the services will support change and skill acquisition in whatever area that the student needs. And sometimes that's directly related to goals, and sometimes the goals are just a little different, you know. Maybe the goals are more academic than social emotional, let's say. So I would, again, you might think it's a cop-out answer, but I would be thinking I want to look at that individually. I don't think I would feel comfortable saying yes to that, saying, yeah, that's true. So that's a true statement. No, I don't. And if sometimes I'm a little too literal myself sometimes, but my first thought is, I don't know. I don't know that I would say personally or professionally that goals drive the IEP. Like, to me, the IEP is bigger than that. Goals are a part of it. So so the only reason I challenge that statement, the idea of the goals drive the IEP, I feel like goals drive where we're going, where we're trying to get the student to go. And assuming that they achieve those goals, sometimes we need more goals after that. You know what I mean? So I think it definitely gives us a path, but I don't know if I would literally be like, well, that drives the whole IEP. I think there's lots of different things that are really important in IEP that aren't goal related. So, for example, size of the classroom. Is it self-contained? Is it not? I really like when districts are able to use either a self-contained room or a resource room as kind of a home base. And as a student, as we see that a student can start, let's say they need self-contained, but they can start integrating into typical classrooms, that they're able to do that the way it's written into the IEP. I understand that it gets tricky legally and all that, but when they're able to do that, I think that's a really great kind of on the spot scenario where we don't have to call a CSE meeting to have this kid try going to math in middle school. Let's go to a different math class because they do well in math and they don't have any behavior problems. Now, I think that's a great thing. So, but that's on the first page of the IEP typically, or in the services section, like what size classroom. So I think, am I making sense? I think there's a lot of pieces of the IEP that are important, and goals are important, no doubt about it. But I don't know, Tina, you have stuff, or anybody else have thoughts on that? I'm gonna heat up my tea. I'll come right back. I swear to God.
Tina's still typing, and from what it sounds like there could be any number of reasons why the goals are not being met. And so it's not necessarily just because the IEP services are inadequate. And I'll just encourage everyone, if you have any other questions, you can put them in the chat. And since there's a pause, I'll also do another shameless plug for the evaluation. I'll pop that in there as well as we wait for Steve. I hope everyone is staying warm and excited for the weekend. Okay. So I'm actually going to add this question as a tag on to the last question, because Steve, you mentioned that you wouldn't necessarily say that goals are like the
The driving
yeah,
force.
drive the IEP, and someone says, but is it true that goals drive the placement?
My first, my first kind of thought is, no, I think a lot of things drive the placement. But I think, I mean, I don't want to, I'm not trying to take away from goals. I want to point out that I think that, you know, the goals are written based on what does the student need. Okay. So I think that they're extremely important. And the goals are the way we're able, one of the measurable ways we should be able to see if there's been progress or not. And that's important, right? Because if there's not progress, then maybe we have to change the goal. Maybe we need a different goal related to this, but maybe we have to step back. So I think that I'm not trying to say they're not important. I'm just saying that I think you have to look at a whole picture. Okay. So again, so I'll put it this way. If we have a goal in the situation I was trying to reference earlier about let's say a resource room that a student can go to every day or every other day if it's block scheduling or whatever. And but also if a student has some anxiety, and so they're kind of an average IQ, but their anxiety really impedes their stuff. So they can use the resource room or the counseling center, or the social worker or guidance sometimes for if they need to go and withdraw. If they need to leave class, they have a pass, they can go there anytime. So if the goal is written about anxiety, about how they're going to learn to cope or manage their anxiety, and there's some objectives in there, we're measuring this. Um, if that goal is going to say, well, we can't keep them in the resource room, then we have to move them into a self-contained room. Well, I want to discuss that. Like I want to talk about that and say, and try to work it out and say, but the resource room and the counseling, like that has really been helpful for this student. And anxiety, it, it's always changing, and the kid was trying to develop. So I want to be able to have them to have access to the math room on days that they're ready. I think that's going to help them feel successful and better about themselves if they can get to math twice a week and still have resource room to do it. So you see what I'm saying? Like, so if the goal is going to drive that placement, then I don't want to change the goal because I want the placement to change. I want to keep the goal focused on the student. Does that make sense to everyone? That's kind of what. So I'm not trying to be difficult for that person who's bringing these questions up. I'm just trying to say we want to look at all of the needs. We want to look at what the IEP looks like, all of it, and make adjustments wherever we need to, where we can, to address the needs.
I've got a nice attendee response, and then I'm also going to read Tina's. Someone said PLEPs are where it's at. Quality PLEPs indicate a student's abilities and needs. The quality PLEP aligns the rest of the IEP, programs, related service, modifications, accommodations, and goals. Nothing should be listed anywhere else in the IEP if it is not indicated somewhere in the PLEP. So it's a nice recommendation tool for people to have in their
Yeah,
box.
agreed.
And then Tina said, before tackling IEP goals, you must understand where the student is academically. Present levels of performance should include information about how the student did on the last year's goals. Did he struggle to meet the goals? Were they not challenging enough? This should be based on educational and functional evaluations that took place over the course of the year. The statement should also include how the student's disability is impacting his progress, involvement, and performance in the gen ed setting. These evaluations and statements should be based on what you, other teachers, and other support staff have observed and recorded. There should be tangible written proof of this progress or of the student's lack of progress. After gathering the data and writing about the student's present levels of performance, It's important to have an idea of what you believe the child can accomplish within a school year, as well as what he can ultimately accomplish overall before sitting down.
Yeah, agreed, agreed.
Um, and I think that's a good place there. I'm actually, so people in the chat, Tina, are asking for the text of what you've written. So if you want as a co-host, you can direct your answers to everyone. I'll still read them out loud, but that way everyone can have them going forward. And
Okay.
for those that weren't posted in the chat, they will be on, like, my narration of them will be on the recording. So the next question is, what is a draft IEP? And to what degree, if any, must one be written before a CSE meeting?
My first thought on like so I typically when I see draft IEPs, it is usually okay, that's not true. Often it is when a student is being identified as a student with special needs. So at the identification meeting, the initial eligibility meeting. But it's true, districts will, I also very often will use a draft IEP for annual reviews. I, off the top of my head, do not think that there's anything in the law requiring that. I think it is pragmatic and helpful for both the school team to kind of put that together before an annual review, certainly in terms of initial eligibility meeting, if they're feeling like this kid probably should be classified as a special needs student. Um, and it can be helpful for the parents as well. It's even more helpful for parents if they can get the draft IEP before they sit down at the meeting. That's also helpful. So they can look it over. Those are my very first thoughts on draft IEPs. I don't think there's anything in the law about them.
I can't speak to if there's anything in the law about them, but my professional background, I actually do a lot of voting access, and it sounds like a draft IEP can almost be used like a sample ballot. You get it ahead of time, you have time to review it and do your research and, like, figure out if there's any changes that you want to make before having to actually mark your ballot and put it in the scanner.
Yeah. I'll say that I have done a lot of work with students with mental health diagnoses, and I've worked hard to get a lot of students classified as special education that happen to have those diagnoses because it impedes their education. And it's not always an easy thing. When I go to an initial eligibility meeting, and if the first thing that I see or is handed out early in the meeting is a draft IEP, it's a very relaxed meeting for me because the district is not going to put together a draft IEP unless they think the student should be classified, right? I mean, it's a lot of work to do that. Even a draft, if it's incomplete, it's a lot of work, and it's also, I mean, the only judgment I will say about that is, um, if that's the first time the parent is getting this info as you walk into eligibility, so yes, it's true. It's nice the district staff are thinking, okay, we did these evals, we saw what you submitted. This student should have an IEP. That's great, but in a very sticky kind of way, the idea of that meeting is have the committee decide together. So the parent wasn't a part of that decision. Now, like I said earlier in one of the other examples, I'm not going to bite the horse. You know what I mean? I'm not going to cut my nose off to spite my face. This is what we wanted. I'm not going to worry that we weren't part of the decision in some ways, but it also is an indicator to me. It might just be pragmatics on the school's end, busy. I get that. But the other thing is, I want to make sure that I'm amplifying the voice of the parent starting at that moment, even more so, especially with mental health, because I think a lot of school professionals understand mental health. I think a lot don't. So I want to make sure the students' needs are individualized and understood. And that's not going to happen in that meeting alone. It's going to happen as we move forward, trying to work with this student and trying to help this student. So that's my thoughts there.
So not the same as the sample ballot. And two, if you're interested in learning more about like mental health in students, we every May have a presentation of some sort about mental health. So be on the lookout for emails for that.
We being the Capital District,
Yes,
task
we being
force.
the Capital District Special Education Task Force. I think we've done one in May every year since I've been part of the task force in 2017. So Tina added, a draft IEP is a preliminary version of an IEP that is not set in stone. This can be done at a pre-CSE meeting. If the IEP team chooses to use a draft IEP, they must provide a copy of the document to the parents well in advance of the IEP meeting. Most will provide it to the parent 5 days before. The finished IEP should be determined by the IEP team during the actual meeting. I think that's great. Tina, are you adding something? I just saw that you might have went back to your, okay. So we've got a few more questions about IEPs. This one says, how do you go about having services provided? How do you go about having services that are being provided outside of the IEP added into the IEP for the following year?
The simple short answer to that is you have to identify that it's a need that needs to be addressed by the school or by the district. So when you say outside services, if you're talking, are you talking about you're having occupational therapy that you're doing through insurance outside of school, or some other service that's happening at school that's not through the IEP? Let's take the first example of you're paying privately for OT for sensory integration, let's say, or maybe fine motor skill, maybe fine motor skills as well. So if you want that to be in the IEP, then you have to develop that it's impeding their education. It's getting in the way, and it's affecting the students' education negatively. So if I can paint with a broad stroke, I don't like to do that, but I'm just gonna, again, I'm having tea here. We're just chatting, right? All of us together. If a lot of times I hear from districts like, all we have to do in terms of OT or PT is to make sure a student can navigate the school. So, and for example, I've not heard this. I'm just going to make this up. This part I'm going to say right now. A lot of times parents still want kids to know how to tie their shoes. But if a district might say, hey, I only see him wearing Velcro, and we don't have to have him learn how to tie, that he doesn't even know how to tie anything in terms of school, that's not our concern. So one, I don't know how, but off the top of my head, you could think, well, how do I argue that? But the idea here is like you want that service to be, you need to say, well, it is going to impede. You have to prove, or at least have an argument for why you would need him to learn how to tie his shoes, or how to be able to tie knots. So, and so I don't have a plan for that. I'm just bringing that into the conversation this morning as one possible example. Probably not a very likely one on either side of the table there. Does that make sense? So that's what I would do. A lot of times with the mental health things, again, with the anxiety, if you're not seeing the anxiety, a lot of times it's harder to get services in place. Not always, but sometimes. So you have to establish that you don't want private counseling through the district, but you do want counseling through the district for the kid to help navigate their day. And districts know that, and they're happy to do that. That's usually a service that's pretty easy to get in place for most of our special needs kids. So I think that's what you have to do, whatever the private service is. Now, if there's something happening at school, I can't think of what.
This is, sorry, not to cut.
Yep, no, go ahead. No.
Thought the someone added, they mean adding things like having a TA in the current class that often acts as a one-to-one. However, the following year there is no aid.
So it's not assigned to the student, it's assigned to the classroom. Am I hearing that
Yes.
right? Um, and just jump in whenever Tina's got stuff, just cut me off. But you know, so again, it really comes back to you have to show that your student needs that extra person. But the idea is, why do they need that person? And this is a really interesting thing that comes up often is, well, do you need them for instruction? Because that wouldn't be a TA typically. That would be like a direct consult, a teacher coming into a classroom to help that student or maybe several students a couple times a week or daily or whatever. So you have to look at what they need and why, not just that it was better. I get the notion that having three people in a class, three adults in a classroom instead of two, or two instead of one, is gonna be better. But part of it in this example could be that that one particular aid really got your kid, really understood, or had skill sets that really melded well with them. So if you come to me with this, you're like, I need someone in there. I'm like, well, let's talk about what was fulfilled last year by that aid. And I'm going to really have a conversation and ask a lot of questions of the parent. And if the kid's available, I might talk with the kid as well and be like trying to help them identify what it was. It wasn't just that another person, most likely. It was what need were they fulfilling for that student. Yeah, it could be, for maybe an attention deficit kid that it really needs a lot of shoulder taps and redirection minute by minute, but I want to discover all of that, and I'm going to do that by asking questions and finding out. And I could, if the parent wants, I can talk with the school district as well. Like, tell me what it looked like last year when that person was here, and then from that info, number one, the goal might you might not need an actual TA in this example. You might need a different service, or you might need other accommodations that will fulfill the same need. I hope that's making some sense. I just said a lot of stuff there, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about that.
And Tina made a great point. She said, if we're talking an aid, we need to prove why is the aid needed. There's a checklist for aids on the state ed website. So there's criteria to meet to have an aid.
Helen, do we have like 2 minutes for me to talk about least restrictive environment for a second?
Yeah.
LRE. Okay, so one thing I want to say in general about LRE is that it should not be, in my professional opinion, it should not be a linear approach. It often is. I always talk about, if you look at the definition of LRE and the regular state regs for special ed, it's not linear. It's a pretty simple one to read. It's got three components. And what it basically says is you you can't you can't just dump kids in a basement or in another classroom. You can't just take special needs kids and just put them off to the side. What it says is we should try hard to, as best as possible, have inclusion and integration so that students with special needs are not just dumped off. So the spirit of it is that you want to include them. But the practicality of it is, what does a student need? That's really what it comes down to. So when I was talking earlier about a day program, we could even say residential, if a kid becomes a behavior problem, a lot of times before their behavior, what I've seen in my experience, before a kid's a behavior problem, districts often, many districts will be talking about, we can't make referrals out because we have to try all the least restrictive first. We have to try regular kindergarten, then we have to try a resource room, or then a self-contained room, or a co-teach, and then a self-contained, before we can try those things. And that's not, that's the experience, but that's not really what always happens. Once there's a real intense behavior problem, all of a sudden, kids on home instruction suspended, and we're looking at day programs then. So that's not linear, okay? And that's okay, because we were looking at what the kid needs. And that's what I want to say with the things we were just talking about, is that's why conversations are so important, because we want to look at, how do we address this together? Maybe there's other things we're looking at. We don't want to look at LRE as binding our hands. We want to keep the spirit of it. And yes, we don't want to just dump kids off, but we want to say, look, sometimes kid needs to start, and once they're identified, they need to go to a self-contained room. Okay. And and again, I feel bad for districts because I think it's very tough to have the way public education is set up and then have special ed law. Public education is set up for groups still 200 years into this country in education, and special ed is individualized. So it's very tough to manage. But that being said, I don't want to, I don't like to hear it when we're like, well, we don't have a self-contained room here, so we're going to have to do co-teach. I'm like, well, you got to either get one or you're going to have to ship them out. Forgive my vernacular there. So there's my point on LRA. Thanks for letting me share that, Helen, everybody. It's been milling around for a little while, so I wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, it's relevant. It makes sense. Tina also put the policy on AIDS from NICEAD in the chat. I added it to my list, so it'll go around with the evaluation. Another question, I'm gonna jump around in order. And again, I'm gonna rephrase it just slightly. Should I inform the CSE committee my plans on getting a insert type of evaluation for my child paid by insurance prior to the IEP meeting?
Can you read that one more time? I think I know what I want to say, but I want to make sure I heard it right.
Should I inform the CSE committee my plans of getting I'll say a neuropsych evaluation for my child paid for by insurance prior to the IEP meeting?
Yeah, my thought is yes, but what's really going to be more helpful is not just informing them. What's really going to be helpful is if you can get it to them, like if we can get either the practitioner, if it's not written up before the IEP meeting, at least if they can maybe join the meeting and spend 10 minutes. So if this is a kid that's already been identified, it's an annual review. Yeah, I think that's helpful information. Okay. Because the premise is it's about the student and it's kind of going to be current, it's new, and how can that be harmful? That's valid information. That's my first thought to answering that. I don't know if Tina's ready with other stuff yet, or I should babble a little bit more, but
You're good. Never feel like you need a babble. We're good.
it
Tina
just comes
said,
naturally to me.
Tina said it's totally up to you, but why not? You do need to send it to them at least 5 days prior to the meeting, but no, the CSE only has to consider the evaluation.
I will add something to this on a personal experience. So my son, I told you, was diagnosed with autism as a preschooler, and then when he was in maybe fourth grade, we stopped seeing the developmental pediatrician stopped seeing him at age 5, and school was doing good by us. Our district was good, and we thought, my wife and I thought we should get another eval, just an updated one through insurance. So we got one from a psychologist that we had heard about that we liked, and she came, she validated things that pretty much, and she added ADHD. She diagnosed him with that. And you put it in good detail about why and whatnot. Now, we didn't share that with the district. And the reason that we didn't, okay, was because we didn't want that to become the narrative for him. We didn't want the district to say this is the most recent, and no one ever removed the autism diagnosis, but we felt like autism really described our son, and ADHD would limit that. Okay, so that was a calculated response on our part. And the other information in there, like it wasn't like what she said about ADHD didn't make sense, and we didn't already know about him, and the school wasn't already seeing in terms of his focus and whatnot. So you have to be careful. I'm not saying we should hold back, but I'm saying I just want to give one example of, yeah, like we didn't share, not because, if it was something really different and we would have said, yeah, we need to share this because this is a different approach, but we didn't feel like this changed the approach to what, and we didn't want to change his classification because he was still a person with autism as he is today. So I guess I share that in terms of, yes, I agree with Tina, like you have the option to whether or not to share. And sometimes you might want to see it before you share. So maybe that answers your question a little bit more. I basically agree with Tina though. Like, well, basically, why not? Like, even if we did share that, so in my story right now, if we did share it with the district, we would still advocate for everything I just discussed with you. That he's a person with autism. Yeah, he has the ADA symptoms, but he's also got these other symptoms, and we're working on all of that. So we would advocate well for that. But just a thought there. Yeah.
We've got some nice comments in the chat. Someone said, sometimes parents do not agree with the evaluation and do not want to share the report. They certainly have the opportunity to speak with the provider about what they disagree with, but I have seen parents get reports that they don't want to share. When they told the district they were getting it, they felt uncomfortable not sharing it.
It's a great point. It's a great point. That's
Yeah.
right. So that kind of leans into a little bit about what we're trying to say, and I would agree with that. So, the information is always the same once you get the report. So even if it misses the annual review meeting, but you're doing it privately, you get it afterwards, and then you're like, okay, I want to share this. You still can, and you can say, we just have this. We got new information. Let's talk about it. Or I just wanted to share this information with you. We don't have to discuss it, but I wanted you to have it. So yes, I agree with all that.
Yeah, I think a lot of the answers to this question depends on like the intent of the evaluation. Are you getting the evaluation to try to get more services? Are you getting it to try to have a primary diagnosis change? All those things, which is why we're getting so many different responses in the chat. Tina made a good point. When you do an outside evaluation, think about what you are trying to accomplish with the evaluation. If depending on what you're trying to accomplish, it may be helpful to have the evaluator there at the meeting with you. And then backtracking just a hair, going back to what Steve was saying about least restrictive environment. Someone said to piggyback on Steve's LRE comment, it's so important to provide opportunities for inclusion anywhere you can. It's not linear and it's not all or nothing with regards to inclusion. Find times and create opportunities for inclusion anytime you can.
Love that. Love it.
And then
And happy to hear it.
yeah. And we've got 2 more questions left, which again is
You're
pacing
doing good.
perfectly with the time. We've got a few minutes left. Someone asked, how do you handle or how would you handle a private school not following the 504 plan that was established by the district of location?
Well, when you say private school, I'm with a 504, I'm making an assumption that it is you're paying privately for a school, like a Catholic school or some other private school. Because I don't know that a 504 can get a kid into a district placement, like a BOCES program. You know what I mean? I would think you need IEPs for that, is my first thought. In general, about 504s, wherever they are, if they're not being implemented, the way you can challenge that is through the Office of Civil Rights. You would have to file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, and the argument you would make here is that the district is discriminating against your child with a disability. So I'm not a lawyer. I don't pretend to be one on TV, but the problem I see with that in general is that it's what I've learned a little bit about is that it's really hard. It's a hard threshold to prove. So let's say counseling is I see is or whatever accommodation is on a 504. Let's say an accommodation. Let's say whatever it might be, and it's not happening. Okay, what you have to prove is that the district didn't provide this because they are discriminating against my youth. And we talked before about the job force crisis, and the shortage of work. So if they're supposed to have an aid in place and someone is sick, calls in sick, and it didn't get delivered for 2 weeks because they couldn't find a sub, that's hard to prove to say, well, they were discriminating. You know what I mean? It's a lower threshold or higher. The threshold is just tough. That's what I have learned. And that's one of the downsides of the 504 in terms of following up. I think a good 504 plan that is followed and implemented can be as good as as an IEP for some students when it's really worked well. But the problem is if it's not happening, it, outside of the things I've been preaching about today, working with your team, communicating with the team at the district or the private school or whatever's happening, that can improve things as well. But there's no real way to press if a district doesn't really have the means or doesn't want to make those changes. There's no way to compel them to do it legally. That's my thoughts on that. I don't know if Tina has something to add or she's.
I look like she's
And I
typing.
hope I got that right. And I don't. So that's why I think when you're talking a private school, it's not been a placement. It's some other. It's been through the family's placement, not through the district placement. So I don't think I've ever heard of a 504 at a private not-for-profit school like Day Treatments or BOCES or whatever. So
Tina says, check if the private school accepts federal funds. If they do, they should be bound by Section 504 of the Rehab Act and must provide qualified disabled students with a 504. Advocate for your child, even though private schools are not legally required to offer accommodations, IEPs, or 504 plans, you can still help your child's needs in more informal ways. Someone
excellent point, Tina. Excellent point. The funding. Great.
or parents can file complaints with the ORC on a 504 plan or OCR. I'm sorry, with the OCR. Someone asked, what kind of school is BOCES considered?
Well, that's boy, you kind of stumped me. I mean, like from the vernacular perspective, I just think of it in my work as a outside option. Whether and again, so some and what it's really nice about BOCES in this area, because it is a little different out in Western New York. They do a different, I mean, similar, same, but also some different things, and they provide it's kind of regional in a way. But around here, what I like about BOCES is that you have the Airline Drive is the new, how many, 5 years ago maybe they built that. It's a new, so it's all BOCES special ed. I don't think they have any non-special ed stuff there that is of BOCES, um, but then there's also they rent spaces in school districts. So when you're talking about need, if you're thinking, I think BOCES have programs that will fulfill my students' needs, you're going to have integration if you can get them. If a program, a self-contained room in a public school district is appropriate for your students' needs, they're going to have access to inclusion right as they go in. Like they're going to have access to those things that is not easily accessed or is not able to be accessed in a self-contained school setting in of itself. So I mean, without looking it up, I would lump it into a private, not-for-profit school setting. I don't know if that's accurate, as I would call a day treatment, because day treatments are typically run by agencies like Northern Rivers. St. Catherine's has one, so that's a little bit different. I don't think BOCES is a cooperative. I don't think it's profit for profit, so it might fit into that definition. But maybe Tina knows more about it than I, or she has another angle on that. I don't know if that was helpful, but that's kind of what I'm thinking there.
Tina said there are 37 BOCES that are partnering with nearly all the state school districts to help meet students' evolving educational needs through cost-effective and relevant programs. The BOCES network is capable of including municipalities and divisions of the state with school districts in the provision of cost-effective services. And someone else said, BOCES is basically an extension of the regional public schools. There are two key parts: career and technical education and exceptional learners division.
Beautiful.
And I'll also add, just as like a note to the question about the private schools, the person said it was a Catholic school. The school district agreed to have it to avoid an IEP. The private school is not following their accommodations for the child. The district is on board.
Okay, so what I'm going to take at, I just want to comment on that. Based on what you said there, what I am thinking, based on the way the way it was worded, my thought is I would go back and quote unquote fight for an IEP. That's what I'm thinking off the top of my head. Going along the lines of the accuracy of what the way you said that and what you said, I would say, well, they're trying to avoid an IEP. If you really know that, and they say, we'll do a 504 in a Catholic school, um, it sounds like what you're saying is your student really needs an IEP. So I would go back to that. And there's several ways to do that. I don't know if I have time to mention that, but I can come back to that if we have time afterwards, because that's a different question. But that's kind of what I would do if you had to re-refer or whatever. But I would go back to that. That's my thought. I don't know if Tina agrees or disagrees. I would love to hear what she has to say about that.
Looks like she's
1 minute. Okay.
If you wanna say briefly the process for going back and getting an IEP, I don't know.
So if you already went through the initial eligibility process and they said they don't qualify for an IEP, if that was relatively recent, like within 6 months, you could go back and challenge that decision if you think you have a good case for that. You can go to due process if you needed to. Um, that's that's one thing you could do. If it wasn't recent, or if they never went through that process, if you had a conversation and they're like, he won't qualify for, or she won't qualify for an IEP, I would make an initial referral in writing. There's ways to do that, but basically you put it in writing and give consent for them to evaluate your student, and you submit information if you have it as well. And I would go through that process. That's the short answer to those two. There's two ways to do that off the top of my head.
And Tina said, if the private school is not going to follow the 504, then no matter what you do with your home district, it's not going to work. I feel like with an IEP, it wouldn't even work.
At the private school.
Yes.
Right. Right. Because you really can't mandate them unless they are getting federal money. But if it's a Catholic school, I doubt that they are. But I don't really know. I don't really know. And you know what else? With that situation, a private school can just say, we're not going to take your money anymore. You can leave. And a Catholic school could do that. They could say, this isn't, they might not say it to you, but they could say it's not worth the headaches to us, or we're not set up for this. So I'm sorry, you can leave. That's one of the downsides of private pay.
And then we've got one last question beyond IEPs. I think it's a perfect way to round us out. Talk as long as you want, or I feel like this could be a good like rapid fire. It says, are annual reviews a good time to discuss anything beyond the IEP for the following academic year? And I'm going to add, if yes, what are good topics of discussion?
Definitely yes. But as we referenced earlier, there's often a time crunch, especially in larger districts, because they just have more students that have IEPs. So they have a lot of IEP meetings to go through over a 6-month period, really January through June. So definitely yes. But if you want to do it at the annual review, you want to be planful and you want to let people know ahead of time, at least a week ahead of time. And sometimes maybe a couple of times as you lead up to your meeting. Everyone likes reminders in this day and age. What topics? I'm going to defer to my cop-out, my alleged cop-out answer. I think it depends on what your student needs. Whether it be something new that you're concerned about, or something that's been there but you don't think it's been addressed well, or at all. I think you want to have conversation. I think that's what I would put a couple of bullet points, say, here's the things I want us to have time for. And the other thing is, maybe if your review is coming up in April, maybe you say, hey, you know what? I'd like to meet outside of that. And don't underestimate the power of a team meeting. In other words, a CSE meeting is a little more difficult for districts to put together by law, by definition, because of who's got to be there. But if you have like the key players of the team and you can get them to meet the teacher, the social worker, or maybe a special ed teacher that's also involved, um, you know, a report from the aides that work in the classroom, perhaps. They rarely come to the meetings, but maybe some information from there. A team meeting can be very powerful, and that can help inform what you're going to do at the annual review. Okay, those are my thoughts on that.
I think Tina is
I
typing.
think, and I guess when you let me know when she's pumped it in there. But in terms of like, well, what things could you bring up? I think the way the laws are written are really like you could be creative in terms of these things. So think about it like brainstorming. Think about what you're worried about, what you think is not working well, or what you're worried might be coming up next year as the work gets harder, like transition from middle school to high school or transition from elementary to middle school. Those are big years and big changes. So be thinking about, gee, okay, what, and sometimes, we think about, we have to know what, as parents, we have to know what we want to ask for. I think that's very stressful. And it's also kind of a bad scenario because a lot of times we might get a lot of no's just based on that. But if we go in saying, hey, I'm worried about these things, or I have some questions about these things with my student, I want to bring them up. I want to talk about them. And then you can ask questions when you get down to talking about them. Like, I think you also then have ideas from the rest of the team in terms of how can we address it. So there's a lot of power in meetings, team meetings or CSE meetings. I see Tina's hands have stopped moving. So
That perfectly adds, she goes, I do not type that fast, sorry. But what you said, Steve, was right on point with what Tina said. Ask the CSE how much time you have for the meeting, create an agenda for the meeting, so get your thoughts on paper, and who do you want at the meeting? Meet with the team to talk about what you want to add to the IEP for the next year. So yeah, prepping ahead of time. Someone also added, I always remind my teachers that it is not a parent-teacher conference. We have an agenda and things to cover. Collaboration and talking about other things are often relevant for the student and the process. However, if things are being discussed that are not relevant to the committee process or the student, then I recommend a follow-up meeting to be scheduled.
great. Yep.
And then super last question, I think it could just be like a yes, no, and then brief. Someone says, is 15 minutes a typical amount of time for a CSE meeting?
No,
That's what I thought.
I've seen 30. Actually, I apologize. Once in a while, I've seen 20 for an annual review, at least for an annual review, which is bothersome, but to me. But typically, I would say it's 30
Yeah.
anyway. Often it's 45 for annual reviews.
Tina said, if you do a pre-meeting, then it could be that fast.
So a pre-meeting, in other words, you're really having like the meeting with not all of the members, but the key members, and you're kind of agreeing on, here's what we're going to do. How do you feel about that? Does it look right? And then you say yes, and then you come in and rubber stamp it in a 15-minute meeting. Yeah, that's a good point. So it's important for parents to be aware of what's happening there. Or if you get your notice for a 20-minute meeting, and if you're getting electronically, that's how you'll find out typically. Or you can reach out and ask, how long do we have, as Tina referenced. Then if you don't have anything else scheduled, you're like, well, are we going to have a pre-meeting? Are we going to have a team meeting to discuss what we're going to do on the actual review date, since it's only 20 minutes? So you want to be proactive on that. Yeah.
Awesome. It looks like Tina might have one last thing to add. She said parents should be the ones to request the pre-CSE. And just last little bit about the 15-minute question. Someone said, no way. And another person said, I've had meetings that lasted over an hour. So varying answers, but sounds like a resounding 15 is too not typical unless there's a pre-meeting.
And I think being proactive is really crucial here. So like, I'm not going to get into it with the district and fight with them saying you have to have a longer meeting than 20 minutes. What I'm going to do is the things we're talking about. I'm going to say, okay, well, when can we have a team meeting, or when can we, because I'm going to let you know what my concerns are, and I want to make sure it's all going to get addressed. And if it doesn't in those 15 minutes, then I'll be like, well, this is not satisfactory. Like, you know what I mean? Like, the proactive and planning ahead is really helpful for everybody, even in a difficult process.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.